Chapter 4. The prayer meeting finally drew to a close, though Jett didn't think it fairly deserved the name. There hadn't been any prayers, despite what Brother Raymond had said, or even him singing, despite the presence of the pipe organ in the corner. The entire event had been nothing more than a long, unnerving harangue from Brother Shepherd. She supposed you could call it a sermon if you were feeling charitable, but she'd been to more than a few services offered by Holiness Movement settlements. There was usually singing, and more than one person preaching. Maybe this was just an everyday holiness meeting. Maybe they have more churchly services on Sundays. She wanted to believe that, but the combination of Brother Shepherd's description of the army of the blessed resurrected and his knowledge of Alsop's destruction wouldn't let her. He could have ridden to Alsop and back before she and White Fox had reached Jerusalem's wall today. But why would he? And White Fox would have seen the fresh tracks. I'll be just as glad to give this place the air, she thought. She'd slip out after dinner. There was no way she could bolt just now without raising suspicion. When she followed Brother Raymond back to the dining room, the men sat down while the women headed for the kitchen. Jett hung back in order to sit as far from Brother Shepherd as she could. Some of the women returned immediately with plates and cutlery and began setting the tables. A place wasn't set for Brother Shepherd at all. Once the tables were set, the women sat down at one of the other tables. Apparently men and women didn't eat together at Jerusalem's wall. Supper consisted of beef and bean stew, tortillas, and pitchers containing Revelation herb tea and water. The table settings were the cheapest kind of tinware, and the pitchers were clay, but when the food was brought out, a silver pitcher and a crystal glass were set at Brother Shepherd's place. Jett expected a prayer to start the meal, but all that happened was that Brother Shepherd filled his glass with some kind of pale amber liquid, and everyone fell to. The portions were generous. Whatever else was going on at Jerusalem's wall, they didn't stint on the victuals, and Jett expected at least to find the meal palatable, if not enjoyable. But one spoonful of stew was all she needed to discover it was as awful as the herb tea had been. No salt. There's no seasoning in anything here. That's why they're serving tortillas. Bread needs salt to rise. Which was when she remembered something else from Tante Mare's ghost stories. Salt would kill a zombie. It was one of the few things that could. Well, not kill it precisely since they were already dead, but Tante Mare said the taste of salt reminded the creatures of who and what they had been when alive, and they would either turn on their creator or lie down and die again. Or both. Every hair on her body stood straight up, or tried to. She began to calculate, urgently, just how fast she could get herself out of here. So, Mr. Gallatin, what brings you to Jerusalem's wall? Brother Shepherd set down his tumbler and regarded her inquisitively. Just passing through, Jett answered. She felt a surge of panic, since for a moment she couldn't remember what she'd told Brother Raymond, and she knew he and Brother Shepherd would have compared notes. Looking for work, I guess, but mostly looking for news of my brother. Perhaps we've seen him, Brother Shepherd said smoothly. What's his name? Horace, Jett answered. Horace Gallatin. She didn't know why she lied. It couldn't matter if she gave either Philip or Jasper as her brother's name. But somehow she didn't want to tell more truth to Brother Shepherd than she absolutely had to. He's got my look to him, she added reluctantly. No, he hasn't stopped here, Brother Shepherd said, shaking his head. You're more than welcome to join our fellowship, though. But you will have to renounce your ways of violence if you do so, Brother Raymond announced. They have no place here at Jerusalem's wall. I'm a man of peace, Jett protested mildly. Who carries a gun, Brother Raymond said harshly. Any feller goin' as a sheep among wolves in these parts is going to find himself skinned, Jett answered inarguably. I'm not especially fond of the idea of dyin', so some varmint can lead himself further into sin. She couldn't tell whether Brother Shepherd believed her or not, but her act of desperation turned out to be an inspired one. Brother Raymond wasn't the trusting sort, and she couldn't get any kind of a read on Brother Shepherd. But now some of the other brethren joined the conversation. In response to their comments, she spun a story that contained a little truth and a lot of what she'd just heard Brother Shepherd preach. Part of it was Philip's story. She knew she looked far too young to have fought in the War of Northern Aggression, but her twin brother hadn't been too young to go with the regiment as its drummer boy. Jett claimed to have been sickened by what she'd seen, and to have returned home after the war to find her family scattered. She said she'd known Horace had gone to Texas, as so many soldiers of the Confederacy had, and so she'd followed him, only to be shocked at the sin and lawlessness she encountered here. "I'm right glad to hear about Alsop," she added. "Once Sister Agatha told me you folks weren't looking to take on a new hand, I figured to push on into town. But it sounds like the kind of place I'd rather steer clear of. Guess I'll head on up north instead." "A wise plan," Brother Shepherd said. "You're welcome to stop here overnight," he added. "Brother Shepherd will be witnessing again before supper. We might even be privileged to receive a revelation." Brother Reuben added enthusiastically. He was the youngest man at the table, and Jett was willing to believe that whatever was going on among the fellowship of the not-so-divine resurrection, Brother Reuben was wholly innocent of it. To her relief, the meal was quickly over. Jett hadn't been able to force herself to eat more than a few bites, though the others had emptied their bowls. When Brother Shepherd rose to his feet, it seemed to be a signal. Everyone else stood as well, and the women began to clear the tables. "Figure I'll unsaddle my horse and turn him out if I'm staying," Jett said, picking up her hat and moving toward the doorway. She didn't add, as she would have otherwise, that she could just go ahead and put her gear wherever she'd be sleeping. Somebody might follow her to show her the way, and that was the last thing she wanted. She settled her hat on her head as she stepped outside. The sight of Nightingale waiting patiently for her was the sweetest thing she'd seen in a long time. With a few quick strides, she reached his side and tucked a toe into the stirrup. A second later, she'd vaulted into the saddle and was heading up the ranch road at a brisk gallop. She didn't care what the fellowship thought about her abrupt departure. She never meant to come back here if she could help it. Once she was well away from the compound, she headed for the stand of pines she and White Fox had used earlier to spy on Jerusalem's wall. She'd told White Fox she'd wait for him back in the pines, but what she'd do if he didn't show up by dusk, she didn't know. The sound of hoofbeats behind her made her put a nervous hand on her pistol, but to her relief, it was only White Fox and Deerfoot. She brought Nightingale to a halt and waited for Deerfoot to catch up. "I got some bad stew and worse news back there," she said when he joined her. "Looks like this place is some kind of commune calling itself the Fellowship of the Divine Resurrection. Their Brother Shepherd says it was angels in Alsop last night." White Fox looked worried. "My discoveries were equally troubling. Perhaps between us we can make sense of our findings." Jett nodded and quickly told him what she knew, from Jerusalem's wall having enough livestock that it needed 40 men to wrangle them, to the bizarre service she'd attended, to being served a meal prepared entirely without salt. And Brother Shepherd wasn't shy about saying Alsop had been cleansed by an army of the blessed resurrected. And he said it was just the first town on their list. "So I guess he's playing things close to the vest, if in your troubles are connected to Alsop's," she finished grimly. "And I don't know about you, but where I come from, a man bragging on something like that is responsible for it." "You may be right," White Fox said, "though I know not how a living man could have done all that you describe, or I have seen, nor do I believe the Wasatchu can summon spirits of vengeance that will act in such a fashion. If prayin' could wipe a town off the map, there'd be a lot fewer folks in a lot of places," Jett agreed, and White Fox nodded briefly before he began his own story. White Fox had waited in the trees until he'd seen Jett enter the house, then circled around until he was concealed by the bunkhouses before riding down to investigate. He left Deerfoot behind one of the new buildings and moved cautiously on foot until he reached a place in a direct line from the gate. A working ranch was a busy place, but this one was both silent and nearly deserted. Whatever he'd been tracking had always moved in a straight line. It had turned down the road heading into the ranch, so his first thought was that it had continued on the same path. But to his frustration, the ground here was just as hard as that of the ranch road had been, and whether his quarry had come this way or not, he could find no sign of tracks. He could continue southward and try again to pick up the trail there, but before he did there were some things he wanted to investigate here. When I approached the dormitory buildings, I could see what had been invisible at a distance. The buildings have shutters, but they cover only wood. "No windows?" Jett asked. The chapel's windows were bricked up too. "Why?" "I have no explanation," White Fox admitted. "But when I went to see if all the buildings followed the pattern of the first, I saw the original bunkhouse's windows had been boarded up as well. And further, the door was barred from the outside." He'd listened carefully at the door for some minutes, and when he was certain the interior was empty, he'd removed the bar. Just as he'd been about to open it, He'd heard the bell ring for dinner and ducked hastily inside. It was empty of furniture, he said. Even the stove had been removed. And in the center of the floor there was a second set of doors, chained shut. "Sounds like you had more fun than I did," Jett observed. "But why bar the door from the outside? And if you did, why chain the inside doors shut? Where do they go, anyway? No bunkhouse I've ever heard tell of came with a storm cellar." "Once more I have no answers, Jett, only questions. Yet I can tell you this much. The trail we followed from Alsop stops at Jerusalem's wall. Once I saw all the members of the fellowship had entered the ranch house and were likely to remain there. I spent more than an hour casting about to see if I could find the trail once more. I could not." "Well, if you couldn't find it, odds are it wasn't there to find," Jett said. She inspected the sky. "I suppose we could wait around until night," she said reluctantly. "Do some more poking around when everybody's asleep in their beds." "I do not think that would be prudent," White Fox said. "Without the key, the doors in the bunkhouse floor will remain locked. It is true that you might shoot the lock off," he added with a faint smile. "But that would be certain to attract just the attention we both hope to avoid." "True enough," Jett said. "Back to town then. If that fool Yankee hasn't either blown it up or burned it to the ground by accident." "I believe you're wrong, Gibbons," White Fox said mildly. "If she has done any such thing, it will be with all deliberate intent." The telegraph machine began chattering precisely at the appointed hour. But even though Jacob Gibbons's communication filled several dozen yards of recording tape, it didn't provide much enlightenment to his daughter. It seemed there was blessed little in the way of useful information to be had. It was said a hoodoo doctor or hoodoo queen could cause a newly dead corpse to rise up and do his or her will. Some said the body had to belong to a suicide, others that it had to be someone who died of a curse. Some said a zombie could be killed by feeding it something containing salt. Other means of zombie destruction included feeding them holy water or blessed wafers, or bringing them within the sound of church bells on a Sunday morning. But Jacob could tell his daughter little more than that. All useless, Gibbons thought in exasperation. "I am willing to believe without a scrap of further investigation that there is not one hoodoo sorcerer within 1,000 miles of where I'm standing. And I am not dealing with the story of one zombie, but of an entire zombie army." She wondered if there was any practical hope of getting a reliable count of the Alsop zombies out of either Jett or Mr. Maxwell. The Llano Estacado wasn't particularly well settled. It would be hard to hide an army of any size here, let alone a zombie army, which, logic insists, would need to be replenished at frequent intervals as decay and putrefaction rendered its members useless. Oh, what nonsense. Dead is dead, and the dead don't just get up and walk around. Papa hadn't stopped with zombies, of course. He'd gone on to acquaint her with every type of fantastic creature that had a claim to the name undead. But vampires were also solitary creatures. Nor had there been an unexplained rash of anemia or disease in the area. Ghouls would disturb fresh graves. Liches were skeletal. Ghosts were often invisible and always incorporeal. Jacob had concluded by saying he'd recently received unimpeachable scientific proof from one of his European correspondents that the earth was hollow and urging her to seek out any deep caves or open wells in the area, for, should the race of subterraneans be disturbed by human encroachment, I feel certain they would react forcefully. And of course by urging her to seek out any phantom airships in the vicinity, for interrogating their captain or crew is likely to be a fruitful source of information. Oh, that's all I need, Gibbons thought in frustration. Now father will wish to go on an expedition to the center of the earth to meet these subterraneans. And I am certain he can find someone willing to guide him there, for a fat fee. At least Dr. Gordon has a certain amount of sense. He will know better than to let father go off on such a wild goose chase. At least until I have gone first. Fortunately, telegraphic communication lent itself to mendacious tactfulness. Gibbons was able to thank her papa for the great help he had given her without letting him suspect how very irritated she was with him. She promised to let him know how her investigations proceeded. If the telegraph lines do not go down, she added carefully, for she had every reason to think that a possibility. Bad weather, high winds, and sabotage could all interrupt communication. And if Alsop had been attacked to conceal some dastardly plot by a person or persons unknown, their next move would be to cut the telegraph wires before some outsider arrived. I am fortunate they have not been cut already, she told herself. Perhaps when Jett and White Fox return, They will have answers for me. But until they arrived, she had another task to occupy her. Gibbons pushed open the door to the jail with a stack of blankets in her arms. She dropped the blankets on the nearest bunk and regarded her preparations with satisfaction. The general store had contained nearly everything she needed. A fine Winchester lever-action repeating rifle. The .44 ammunition both Jett and White Fox's pistols used. Cartridges for her own coach gun. Kerosene lanterns and a tin of paraffin oil. Tin pails to hold drinking water. Last of all, she entered the rooming house. In the kitchen she found tinned butter, loaves of bread only a little stale, a roast of beef that was still good, and most of an apple pie. She made a dozen sandwiches and wrapped them in oilcloth for safekeeping, and put the sandwiches, the pie, and plates and utensils into a hamper she'd also liberated from the general store. She doubted any of this would be necessary, but she also knew if Alsop's attackers hadn't been able to enter the jail last night, they'd be equally confounded tonight, if they returned at all. If they didn't, well, the jail was comfortable enough to spend the night in. And because she didn't care to trust that the drunken actor wouldn't stumble upon her vehicle by accident and break something, she had locked it. It would take a cannon to break into it. On her way back from the rooming house, Gibbons stopped at the saloon. It took her several minutes of hunting behind and beneath the bar to unearth a dusty and still-sealed bottle of French brandy, though she doubted it had been any closer to Paris than Chicago. While she didn't approve of spirits for intoxicating purposes, Gibbons had a great respect for their powers of revivification, and it was only prudent to prepare for every possibility. Finley Maxwell was still in residence, although he'd apparently been defeated at last by the water of life. He was asleep in a corner, a bottle clutched protectively to his chest. Gibbons was heading in the direction of the jail to add the basket to the rest of her supplies when she saw Jett and White Fox heading up the street at a brisk trot. "Come on," Jett shouted as soon as she saw her. "Get your buggy and fire it up. They're coming this way." It was later than Jett liked when she and White Fox started back to Alsop. She comforted herself with the reminder that it was still daylight. She knew zombies were helpless during the day, but as they rode, the shadows began to lengthen. The edge of town was a couple of miles distant when the wind shifted. The wind was cold. Nightingale raised his head, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. A moment later, Jett smelled what he had. Rotting flesh. "They're coming back," she cried to White Fox. Neither of them had to urge their animals to gallop. The horses obviously wanted to get far away from whatever they smelled. As they approached Alsop, Jett saw Gibbons walking up the empty street lugging a large basket. She shouted out her warning, but instead of running toward wherever shed tucked her steam wagon, Gibbons stopped dead. "If by they you mean your zombies, I certainly hope so. You obviously haven't brought one back for me to study." You, Jett sputtered in disbelief. "You must heed Jett's warning," White Fox said. "Unless this unknown enemy intends to assault Fort San Antonio instead, Alsop is their destination." "Then my preparations can be put to good use," Gibbons said briskly. "I've equipped the jail with everything we'll need, and I am pleased to tell you I locked my vehicle against tampering. I suggest you take your animals to the livery stable, and then join me there. And bring Mr. Maxwell with you. He's unconscious on the floor of the saloon," she shouted over her shoulder as she walked on. "She's crazy," Jett said flatly. "Perhaps," White Fox said, "but she's also right. A jailhouse is designed to withstand attack from within and without." He swung down off his mare's back and tossed her rein to Jett. "I will see to Mr. Maxwell. Take Deerfoot with you. If she must flee to protect herself, she will come when I whistle for her. Any varmint living or dead that tries to make off with Nightingale will think better of the notion before he's much older," Jett answered grimly. At the livery stable, Jett saw Gibbons's wagon parked in the back. Reckon that contraption wouldn't get far in the dark, she told herself reluctantly. She'd still have preferred to make a run for it, but she had to admit there were more than a few hitches in that rope. What if the creatures decided to encircle the town this time? She might ride right into them. It was the work of only a few moments to untack both horses. She led them into stalls at the front of the barn and left them loose. She left the stable door open too. White Fox was right. Their ability to run was the best protection the animals could have. With their saddlebags slung over one shoulder and Nightingale's tack, for there was enough silver on saddle and bridle to make it an attractive target, she headed for the jail at a quick jog. On the way, she caught up to White Fox. He had Finley Maxwell slung over one shoulder. "Is he dead?" she asked. "Dead drunk," White Fox answered succinctly. As they entered the jailhouse, Gibbons dropped the bar across the door to seal them in. 2 of the cells were filled with her store of provisions. White Fox carried Finley Maxwell to the 3rd. It was one of the end ones. He laid Maxwell on the bunk and covered him with a blanket. Jett dropped her saddle with a grunt of relief and carried bridle and saddlebags to the cell at the opposite end from Maxwell. "Well, here we are," Gibbons said brightly, lighting 2 of the lamps. Their warm, incongruously cheery glow filled all 3 cells. The 2 on the ends had a solid back wall and one side wall. The one in the center had bars on both sides and a tiny window above head height. The window was barred and too small for anyone to climb through, even if it hadn't been. "Caught like rats in a trap," Jett grumbled, dropping her saddlebags to the floor. "You may make yourself useful, Mr. Fox," Gibbons added, ignoring Jett. She picked up 2 of the blankets and handed them to him. "Your room is next door." White Fox smiled faintly and carried the blankets into the adjoining cell. He returned for one of the unlit lanterns and set it on the floor of the cell he was to occupy. Jett sat down on the cot by the wall, pulling off her hat and setting it aside. She stared toward the back wall of the cell as if it were a window, and in the soft glow of the lamplight Gibbons could see Jett was some years younger than she'd originally thought her to be. She wondered how Jett Gallatin had come to live as a man. "I'll probably get these walls to talk before she does," she told herself with a mental snort. "While we're waiting to be overrun by your zombies," Gibbons said, "why don't we have something to eat? A cold supper is better than no supper. And you can tell me where that trail of yours led." "Nowhere that made a darned bit of sense," Jett grumbled. "And I don't figure I want to listen to you tell me about how nothing I saw was so." Gibbons blinked in surprise at the hostility she heard in Jett's voice. Certainly she didn't believe Jett had seen zombies here in Alsop last night, but neither did she think Jett had made up some story. "It's true I find the possibility of zombies unlikely in the extreme," she said slowly, "but it is not your account I dispute, merely your interpretation of it. It is very easy to be mistaken. If we discover you are right and I am wrong, I will assuredly tell you so. But meanwhile, I am investigating similar disappearances. I need all the data I can collect to make sense of them, and your report is vitally important." Jett stared at her for a moment. "That is the long-windedest sorry I've ever heard. But I guess I wouldn't mind some of your cold supper while I tell you my part of the tale." The 3 of them gathered in the cell Gibbons had turned into her temporary home, and over sandwiches and pie, White Fox and Jett told Gibbons about tracing the trail back to Jerusalem's gate and what each of them had found there. Gibbons frowned as she considered the new information. It didn't fit into what she'd learned this afternoon, but she was too good a scientist to concern herself with that. In turn, she told them all she'd found in Sheriff Mitchell's charge book and the newspaper archives. "That doesn't make sense," Jett protested. "If the cattlemen wanted everybody else to clear off their range, why leave Jerusalem's wall alone? Or," she frowned, thinking hard, "if the ranchers weren't running the settlers off, why didn't the paper complain about Jerusalem's wall as much as about the rest of the settlements?" "I really don't know what to tell you," Gibbons said with a shrug. "I have a number of facts, but so far they don't suggest a theory, and there's absolutely no point in coming up with a theory and looking for facts to support it. Some of the things about this fellowship could be just oddities or coincidence, but I would like to know how this brother shepherd knew something had happened to Alsop. And what's in that double, locked bunkhouse too?" Jett snorted. "White Fox wouldn't let me shoot the padlock off. But what other disappearances? You said none of the stories in the Yell and Cry made any of the Eastern papers." "No," Gibbons agreed, "nor the Pacific ones. But there've been more inexplicable vanishings than just those few the Yell and Cry mentions. I investigate such outlandish happenings." Just as she'd done for White Fox, Gibbons told her story to Jett. "So I came east on the trail of Father's phantom airships, though I doubt their existence very much, and I met Mr. Fox here. And he's on the trail of the same thing." Jett glanced at White Fox. "So he said, first time I ever heard of the Blue Bellies investigating much of anything." White Fox could see the fear Jett tried to conceal with bad-tempered words. He'd seen her terror the previous evening and knew how intolerable she must find it to be trapped and waiting for the return of the enemy she had fled from. My investigation is in the nature of favor to one of the soldiers at Fort Riley. He said, I am a civilian scout attached to the 10th. The Buffalo Soldiers, Jett said, nodding. They're good folks to have at your back in a scrap. He saw Gibbons was surprised at Jett's comment, but he was not. The Buffalo Soldiers were comprised of former soldiers, and there had been Negro soldiers fighting on both sides of the recent war. Nor was everyone in the South the monsters of cruelty Miss Stowe had portrayed in her novel. How'd you end up with them? Jett asked. If you don't mind me asking, she added politely. It is a story I am more than willing to tell, he answered, though I fear it is not particularly interesting nor unique. Some 13 years ago, a mixed hunting party of Sac and Fox came across the wreckage of a wagon train. They rescued the young boy, a child of 4, who was its only survivor, and raised him as their own. But wasn't anyone looking for you? Jett asked, understanding without more explanation who that boy must have been. I've never heard of the agency leaving a white child in the hands of Indians. My tribe had little to do with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, White Fox answered. The remains of the Meshkwakahake moved west of their own volition after Black Hawk's War and owned, under Anglo law, the land on which they lived. I was 10 years old before I saw my first white man, a good and learned soul. Dr. Singer was both minister and physician, offering both skills freely to anyone who would accept them. Through the years, he urged me to rejoin those whom he spoke of as being my own people, but he never strove to compel me to do so. I knew I would never find my place among them, but I also came to realize I was not truly Meshkwakahake either. Working as an army scout gives me a place in both worlds. There was more to his story than he'd told, but he did not feel it was yet time to share it. He had not become a scout out of free choice. 2 years ago, he'd been away from his village on a trading expedition. He'd returned to find his village destroyed, his tribe and their livestock slaughtered. He'd ridden to the nearest fort, bent on vengeance, only to find his people had not been the victims of yet another white massacre. Upon hearing his story, the fort's commander sent a troop to investigate, and much against his will, White Fox had come to believe the soldiers and the nearby Anglo settlers were truly innocent of the outrage. He'd been offered a job with the army after that, and had taken it in hopes of finding some way to bring justice to his murdered people. He'd never discovered who had been responsible, but in his searching he found there'd been a similar massacre 12 years before, one identical in nearly every detail. A wagon train. In the spring of 1853, a party left Independence, Missouri, to begin the 6-month journey that would take some of its members to California, some to Oregon, and some to Utah. There'd been nearly 100 wagons in the train, for all 3 routes lay together until Omaha, Nebraska. From there, 50 wagons had continued toward Oregon. The regiment that later came across the wreckage of that wagon train described it as a slaughterhouse. Every living thing had been dismembered as if with axes, and the wagons themselves had been broken into kindling. The time and place matched the wagon train from which he'd been rescued, and what the Meshkwakahake hunting party had seen had matched the army's description. He'd never thought to see a scene of such violence with his own eyes until the day he had discovered himself cruelly orphaned, yet a second time. He brought his tale to a close by recounting the mystery of Glory Rest in more detail than he had provided to Gibbons on the previous evening. Caleb Lincoln, on whose behalf I went to Glory Rest, had good cause to be alarmed. And what I found there, and afterward, makes me. He broke off mid-sentence as the air within the jail suddenly turned chill and foul. Gibbons instantly leaped to her feet to douse both lamps. For long moments the 3 of them sat in the dark, straining their ears for some sound from the outside. The spoiled meat reek was stronger with each passing moment, and White Fox thought of herds of buffalo killed by white buffalo hunters and left to rot where they fell. Then the silence was broken by a weighty thud, Finley Maxwell's hat fallen from the bunk to the floor. "Mr. Maxwell, pray be quiet," Gibbons said in a loud stage whisper, but her admonition had no effect. They heard thumping and banging as Maxwell staggered to his feet and lurched about his cell. More thumps told the listeners he was careening off the walls. Then the door of the cell rattled as he fell against it. "If you don't shut your noise, the zombies are going to get all 4 of us," Jett whispered loudly. In the distance, the sound of a window breaking could be heard. There was another loud thump from the far cell, then silence. White Fox rose to his feet as Gibbons struck a lucifer match against one of the bars of their cell. In the light, he could see Maxwell lying immobile on the floor. The match burned down quickly. Gibbons dropped it with a hiss and struck another. Then, before either White Fox or Jett could stop her, she flung open the door of their cell and dashed into Maxwell's. "You bring those things down on us, and I'll kill you myself," Jett whispered furiously. There was another scraping sound as Gibbons struck another match. In its glow, White Fox could see she was now kneeling beside Maxwell's body. "He's dead," Gibbons said in bewildered tones. "And we're gonna be if you don't stop striking lights," Jett hissed. White Fox got to his feet and moved silently through the darkness toward the center cell. "Hoof," Gibbons gasped as she collided with him. "I wish to see," he began, just as Jett ran into him from behind. "Will you both get out of my way?" she demanded. The window looked out on the back of the buildings, and Jett had to stand on the bunk, then lean out as far as possible to see through it. For a moment, she didn't think there'd be anything to see from back here. Then she saw movement. Half a dozen zombies shuffled past the window. Every one of them was carrying something, and the smell of them was enough to make her regret the meal she'd eaten. So much for men resurrected into the nature angels, who don't need food or any worldly goods. She didn't care how much proof Gibbons insisted on. Jett knew Brother Shepherd was behind this, somehow. Another zombie shuffled by, closer than the first ones. Its head rocked and rolled on its shoulder with every step it took. Its neck was obviously broken. Even dead, she recognized him. It was Mr. Trouble, the bully who'd been about to challenge her last night, just before the zombies attacked. Not only had he died in the bar fight, he'd come back. He smells just as bad dead as alive, she thought, on the edge of hysteria. She dropped down before Gibbons started bellowing about getting a chance to look out the window. Jett felt around in the darkness until she found her, then put her mouth by Gibbons's ear to breathe a description of what she'd seen. "I need to see," Gibbons answered in an urgent whisper. Jett led her over to the window and knelt down as she guided Gibbons's foot into the stirrup she formed with her hands. Gibbons quickly stepped up onto Jett's back to peer through the window. At first, Gibbons thought it must be some trick to befool the credulous. None of the manifestations she'd seen so far would be easy to create under these frontier conditions. But since she'd been a child of 12, she'd been uncovering the tricks used by con artists of every description. Card ice, or dry ice, was easy enough to manufacture if one had a few simple chemicals, and a wagon load of it would account for the cold. The stench of putrefaction wouldn't even need to be artificially manufactured. All one would need was rotting meat and a strong stomach. Add to that an artful costume and some grease paint to counterfeit the pallor of the grave, and presto, zombies. But the parade of the dead passing by in front of her began to shake her conviction, loath though she was to admit it. A missing limb could be faked easily. A broken neck or crushed skull could not. For a single moment, terror overwhelmed her. She fought it down with the best weapon in her arsenal against emotion: logic. She did not have the leisure to be afraid. She had to find the method behind this. Once she had the method, these horrors could be wiped from the face of the earth. Science first, then vapors. "I must have a specimen to study," she whispered in near hysterical excitement as she jumped down from Jett's back. "You're crazy," Jett answered flatly, getting to her feet. "How am I to determine how they are created without studying one?" Gibbons demanded in exasperation, grateful to feel exasperation instead of fear. Jett ought to be glad she was trying to find proof that zombies were real instead of calling her unfounded names. "It would be far too dangerous," White Fox whispered. "It will save hundreds of lives, perhaps thousands. If Jerusalem's wall was behind the zombies, well, Brother Shepherd had already said he was sending his blessed resurrected on a rampage. It will get us dead," Jett insisted. "If," she was undoubtedly about to go on, when the door of the jailhouse began to rattle. All three of them froze. The rattling continued for a few seconds, then it was replaced by loud thumping. Something far stronger than any man was trying to break down the door. It was a heavy door and a heavy bolt, but as the thumping continued, Gibbons began to fear the door wouldn't hold. The terror returned, and this time logic wouldn't keep it at bay. Logic said, "That door can't hold forever." She heard a faint, distinctive click as Jett slowly eased the hammer back on her Colt. Then all of a sudden there was silence once more. Before Gibbons could demand help to get to the window again, Jett had leaped to the bunk and was peering out. "What is it? What do you see?" Gibbons demanded urgently. It's the preacher man, Jett answered. It's Brother Shepherd. Brother Shepherd looked to be in fine fettle this evening. He was wearing a long frock coat and a low-crowned hat, and he looked like a doctor, or the preacher his people claimed he was. What he certainly didn't look was reanimated. He was standing at the back of a freight wagon, wholly unconcerned by the zombies lurching past him to deposit their plunder in it. She was about to tell Gibbons and White Fox more, when suddenly Brother Shepherd threw back his head and began caterwauling. The sound was half rebel yell, half lamentation. It made the hair stand up on the back of her neck. There seemed to be words mixed into it somehow, but she couldn't make them out. Sounds like somebody stepped on a cat, she muttered under her breath. It's no language I know, she heard Gibbons whisper. Jett jumped down from the bunk. Brother Shepherd kept right on yowling. Maybe a few, she began. She broke off with a hiccup of indrawn breath. There was an unmistakable sound of movement from the other cell, the one that contained Finley Maxwell's body. He isn't dead, White Fox said, sounding baffled. But I checked, Gibbons protested. He was, Jett said. It isn't locked, White Fox said. Who locks up a corpse? Gibbons demanded. Just like before, they could hear the sound of Maxwell thrashing around his cell. Only it wasn't Maxwell now. It was creature that meant to do Brother Shepherd's bidding. Once it got out of its L, it would open the jailhouse door. I need light, Jett said urgently. She was already moving before either Gibbons or White Fox responded. She shoved open the cell door and launched herself into the darkness, navigating by memory. A moment later, she had the jailhouse keyring in her hands. Someone lit one of the lamps, turning the wick down as far as possible. The faint glow was enough to let Jett see where she needed to go. The thing that had been Finley Maxwell was in front of the door to its cell, pawing blindly at the bars. The door rattled in its frame. Jett launched herself forward, shoving the key into the lock. It didn't turn. The wrong one, Jett thought frantically. She fumbled for the next key on the ring. The thing in the cell reached through the bars, patting clumsily at her, as if it didn't know what she was, and moaning faintly. The keyring fell from her fingers, hitting the floor with a jangle. She bit her lip hard and snatched it up again. Which key had she already tried? She couldn't tell. She chose one at random and jammed it into the lock. The tumblers clicked as Jett turned it. At the sound, the zombie's movements quickened. It clawed at her arm, her shoulder, its mouth open in a horrible silent scream. She jerked the key from the lock and threw the key ring as far behind her as she could. The thing in the cell clutched at her with impossible strength. Soon its hands would find her throat. Strong arms, living arms, encircled Jett's waist from behind. White Fox dragged her free of the zombie's grasp. The moment they reached the far cell, Gibbons blew out the lamp in the center cell. Jett blinked back tears, grateful for the concealing darkness. She wouldn't let them see her cry. She wouldn't let anyone see her cry. She sat down on the bunk and tried to stop shaking. Somewhere in those frantic minutes spent trying to lock the zombie's cell before it could get out, Brother Maxwell's squalling had grown fainter. Now the loudest sound was the thumping and rattling of the former Finley Maxwell as it tried to free itself. You have the heart and spirit of a great warrior, Jett Gallatin, White Fox said quietly. You would have done the same, she said gruffly. She knew it shouldn't matter, but she felt strangely warmed by his praise. You got there first, Gibbons said, sitting down beside her. She took Jett's hand and pressed something small and cool into it. Here, brandy. Jett managed to unscrew the cap. She tilted the tiny ask to her lips and drained it. The liquor burned down her throat. Thanks, she said. She took a deep breath. Looks like you've got your zombie after all. She heard Gibbons make a small sound of annoyance, but when she spoke, her voice shook a little. I know he was dead. What I want to know is, how did he come back to life? Jett saw a flicker of shadow. White Fox had returned to the center cell, taking care to stay out of Maxwell's reach, and was looking out the window once more. They're leaving, he said when he returned to their cell. Brother Shepherd and his zombies. Oh, good, Jett said shakily. I can't stand crowds. Gibbons sat on the floor of her cell, while the other two took turns at the window. She had seen all she could stand, and right this moment, it was all she could do to sit in one place and shake, with her knees pressed up into her chest and her arms wrapped around them. The bottom had dropped out of her universe. In her world, the dead did not walk. There was no magic, there were no supernatural explanations. Science had a name and a cause for everything, Or if it didn't now, it would soon. Things like this did not happen. But they had, and that meant everything she had faith in was wrong. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run home to San Francisco and hide in her rooms forever. She wanted to drive her auto tacopode to the nearest railhead, abandon it, board a train, and never, ever, leave a place that was safe again. She put her head down on her knees and let herself cry silently. She didn't frighten easily. She would have said she didn't frighten at all until today. But how could anyone have looked on the faces of those things and not been afraid? She couldn't let the others know how afraid she was. If they knew, they wouldn't trust her judgment. She had to get to the bottom of this and find the cause, more importantly, the cure. But right now, Gibbons wished very badly for her papa.